The auction, nobody understood. The rain had started before sunrise and never really stopped. It drifted across the county fairgrounds in a cold gray mist, turning the dirt parking lot into a patchwork of mud and shallow puddles. Trucks lined the fence rows. Farmers stood beneath worn jackets and faded caps, nursing paper cups of coffee while watching another family's life get sold piece by piece. Caleb Mercer kept his hands buried deep in his coat pockets. He wasn't there to buy much. At least, that had been the plan. The auction was being held on what used to be the Hensley farm, a property that had survived 3 generations before finally surrendering to debt. The machinery sat arranged in long rows across the wet field: combines, cultivators, grain carts, seed drills, fuel tanks, pieces of someone's history, now reduced to lot numbers. Caleb knew the feeling. 2 years earlier, his wife Emma had died unexpectedly after a brief illness. Since then, life had become a sequence of practical decisions: feed bills, school pickups, equipment repairs, mortgage negotiations. There wasn't much room left for grief, not when 2 children depended on him. His son Owen was 10. His daughter Lily was 15. Both had learned far too early how often adults pretended everything was fine. The wind pushed another wave of drizzle across the lot. Caleb adjusted the brim of his cap and studied the machinery. Most of it was beyond his budget. Truthfully, nearly everything was beyond his budget. The previous season had been brutal. Rising fuel costs, poor yields, and an irrigation pump failure had left his small leased operation hanging by a thread. His oldest tractor had nearly caught fire during harvest. The second one spent more time in the repair shed than in the field. A normal person would have stayed home, but farmers weren't always normal people. Sometimes they kept showing up because stopping felt worse. The auctioneer's voice crackled through portable speakers. Lot 74. Bidding started, numbers climbed, equipment sold quickly. Caleb watched without raising his hand, until he saw them. 6 tractors sat near the far end of the yard. They looked forgotten. Not vintage enough for collectors, not functional enough for farmers. Just 6 rust-covered machines parked together like abandoned relics. Most people barely glanced at them. One had a broken exhaust stack. Another was missing part of its hood. Paint had long since disappeared beneath layers of oxidation and grime. A few local farmers laughed as they passed. Scrap metal would cost more to haul than they're worth. Somebody ought to bury those things. Caleb kept staring. Something felt wrong, or maybe right. He wasn't sure yet. He walked closer. Rain tapped softly against steel. The tractors carried different manufacturer badges and came from different decades. Yet, the rear assemblies looked strangely similar. He crouched beside one machine, mud soaked through his jeans. His fingers brushed against a welded bracket hidden beneath years of dirt. He frowned. The weld was old, very old, but it wasn't factory work. Someone had modified the tractor. Carefully, deliberately, Caleb moved to the second machine, then the third. The same pattern appeared again. Different tractor, same modification. His pulse quickened slightly. That didn't happen by accident. Not 6 times. A memory surfaced. He was 14 years old again, standing beside his father in a machine shed. His father had been examining an irrigation assembly salvaged from a junkyard. Most people saw rust. His father saw ideas. Machines tell stories, he'd said. You just gotta know where to look. Back then, Caleb thought it sounded ridiculous. Now, kneeling in the mud decades later, he found himself remembering every word. The auction continued behind him. Engines started. Trailers rattled. Bidders shouted. But Caleb barely heard any of it. His attention remained fixed on the tractors. The modifications weren't random repairs. They formed a system, a purpose, something hidden. He stood and wiped rainwater from his face. "What are you seeing?" The voice came from behind him. Caleb turned. It was Ray Sutton. Neighbor, friend, occasional critic. Ray glanced toward the tractors and laughed softly. "Those things?" "Maybe nothing," Caleb replied. "That's usually what people say before they spend money they don't have." Caleb smiled faintly. "Fair point." Ray stepped closer. "You planning to buy one?" Caleb hesitated. The truthful answer worried him, because he wasn't thinking about one. He was thinking about all 6. Even saying it inside his own head sounded insane. The auctioneer eventually reached their section. Most buyers wandered elsewhere. Interest vanished almost immediately. The tractors sat neglected while newer equipment attracted attention. Lot after lot passed. No bids, no competition. Rain drummed softly against metal. Caleb's heart began beating faster. This wasn't a business decision anymore. That realization unsettled him. Good business decisions came with spreadsheets, calculations, certainty. This felt different, more instinct than logic, more curiosity than confidence. The auctioneer glanced around. Anyone interested? Silence. A few people chuckled. The auctioneer lowered the price. Still nothing. Lower. Nothing again. Caleb looked down at his boots, then back at the tractors, then toward the cloudy horizon. He thought about Emma, about hospital bills, about Owen's school shoes that needed replacing, about Lily pretending not to notice overdue notices on the kitchen counter. This was a terrible idea. Every rational part of him knew it, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing in front of something important. Not valuable. Important. There was a difference. His hand rose. A single bid. Several heads turned. Ray stared at him. You're serious? Apparently he was. The auctioneer called for additional bids. None came. Not one. A minute later, the tractors belonged to Caleb Mercer. All 6. The laughter wasn't cruel, mostly confused, the kind people use when they genuinely cannot understand what someone is doing. Caleb didn't blame them. He wasn't entirely sure himself. As paperwork changed hands, he felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach. Fear. The practical kind. The kind that arrives after commitment, when turning back is no longer possible. By afternoon, he was hauling the first tractor home. Rain streaked across the windshield. The machine rattled behind him on the trailer. Every bump in the road seemed to ask the same question. What have you done? The Mercer farm appeared through the drizzle just before evening. A modest farmhouse. Weathered barns. Fields stretching toward distant tree lines. Nothing about it suggested opportunity worth millions. At the moment, it barely suggested survival. Lily stood on the porch when he arrived. She watched silently as the first tractor rolled into the yard. Then the second. Then the third. By the fourth, she folded her arms. Please tell me those are temporary. Caleb laughed. I wish I could. Owen emerged behind her. His eyes widened immediately. Are those ours? Technically. They look dead. That's one way to describe them. The boy grinned. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, Caleb noticed. Small victories mattered. After dinner, long after the children went upstairs, he walked alone toward the machine shed. The rain had finally stopped. Cool air carried the smell of wet earth and diesel fuel. Moonlight filtered through broken clouds. The 6 tractors sat quietly inside the building, shadowed, silent, waiting. Caleb switched on an overhead work light. A warm yellow glow spread across rusted steel. The shed settled around him, with old creaks and distant metal pops. He approached the nearest tractor, slowly. Something still bothered him, or intrigued him, maybe both. He grabbed a flashlight and crouched beside the rear assembly again. The same hidden bracket, the same unusual weld. This time he noticed something else. A panel that shouldn't have existed, half concealed beneath decades of grime. His heartbeat slowed, then accelerated. Carefully, he scraped away dirt with a screwdriver. More metal appeared, more evidence of deliberate craftsmanship. Not factory work, not amateur work either. Whoever built this knew exactly what they were doing. Caleb wiped his hands on a rag, then reached for a wrench. Outside, the wind moved through distant fields. Inside, only the sound of metal against metal echoed through the shed. The first bolt loosened, then another. A few minutes later, the hidden panel finally shifted, just enough to reveal something underneath. Caleb froze, not because he fully understood what he was seeing, but because he understood enough. The same strange system existed inside the machine, exactly where he suspected, and suddenly one question became impossible to ignore. If someone had hidden this design inside one tractor, that was unusual. If they had hidden it inside 6, then what exactly had he just brought home? The secret buried in steel. The hidden compartment kept Caleb awake most of the night. Long after the farm had gone quiet, he sat alone beneath the yellow glow of the workshop lights, staring at the exposed machinery inside the tractor. The system wasn't complicated. That was what bothered him. Most breakthroughs looked impressive. They announced themselves through complexity, layers of electronics, expensive components, sophisticated engineering. This was the opposite. Simple, elegant, almost invisible. The kind of solution that seemed obvious only after someone else had already discovered it. Caleb ran a grease-stained finger across the assembly. a series of custom-fabricated hydraulic controls connected to a modified traction system. Nothing revolutionary on its own, yet every piece appeared designed around one goal: efficiency. Not speed, not power, efficiency. He sat back on an overturned bucket. The shed smelled of oil, rust, and damp soil. Outside, darkness stretched across the fields. Inside, questions multiplied. Who built this? Why hide it? And why had 6 different tractors received nearly identical modifications? The answers weren't sitting inside the machine, but clues were. The next morning began before sunrise. As usual, farms didn't pause for mysteries. Cattle still needed feeding, equipment still needed maintenance, bills still arrived. By 6 o'clock, Caleb was repairing a broken fence, while Owen followed behind carrying tools. The boy had inherited his mother's curiosity. "What were you doing last night?" Caleb looked up from the wire he was tightening. "What makes you think I was doing something?" "The workshop light was on until after midnight." Caleb smiled. "You spying on me?" "No. Maybe a little." Caleb laughed. For a moment, the weight he'd carried for years felt lighter. "Found something interesting?" "What kind of something?" "Not sure yet." Owen considered that, then nodded. Apparently, that answer was acceptable. Children often understood uncertainty better than adults. By afternoon, Caleb returned to the tractors. This time he began inspecting all 6 systematically. Notebook in hand. Measurements, sketches, observations. Hours passed. Patterns emerged. The modifications weren't identical. They were evolving. Each tractor represented a slightly different version of the same idea. Like someone had spent years testing improvements, experimenting, learning, refining. The realization sent a chill through him. These weren't random repairs. They were prototypes. By sunset, pages filled his notebook, and one detail refused to leave his mind. Every modification focused on reducing soil compaction. That mattered more than most people realized. Heavy machinery slowly damaged farmland. Compressed soil restricted root growth, limited water absorption, and reduced long-term productivity. This unknown mechanic apparently hadn't. Someone had spent years trying to solve a problem everyone else ignored. The following week became an obsession. Caleb worked the farm during daylight, studied tractors at night, sleep became optional, coffee became essential. Lily noticed first. One evening she entered the kitchen and found him surrounded by manuals, notebooks, and parts diagrams. Bill sat untouched nearby. "You know normal people watch television at night?" Caleb looked up. Normal people aren't trying to understand 6 mystery tractors. She rolled her eyes. "You sound excited." The observation caught him off guard. Excited. He hadn't felt that in a long time. Not since before Emma died. Not since life became a series of obligations. He glanced back at the diagrams. Maybe Lily was right. For the first time in years, he wasn't just surviving. He was curious again. The feeling scared him, because hope could be expensive. 3 days later, another problem arrived, in the form of a pickup truck. The bank manager climbed out carrying a folder. Caleb recognized the expression immediately. Nobody drove 20 miles to deliver good news. The conversation took place beside the grain bins. Polite, professional, painful. Loan deadlines, operating costs, future projections, numbers that all pointed in the wrong direction. The manager wasn't hostile, just realistic. "The farm needs a stronger season, Caleb." "I know. We're running out of room." "I know." The man hesitated, then glanced toward the machine shed. "The tractor's helping?" Caleb almost laughed. How could he explain? At the moment, the tractors were producing exactly $0. Yet somehow they felt like the most important thing on the property. "I think they might." The banker studied him carefully, not judging, just concerned. Make sure thinking turns into knowing. Then he left. The dust from his truck lingered in the air long after he disappeared down the road. That evening, Caleb sat alone on the porch, watching the sunset, listening to crickets emerge from the fields. For the first time since buying the tractors, doubt returned, heavy, persistent. What if he was chasing nonsense? What if grief and exhaustion had clouded his judgment? What if everyone else had been right at the auction? The screen door opened behind him. Lily stepped outside carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. She handed him one. Neither spoke immediately. The silence felt comfortable. Eventually she nodded toward the workshop. "Still think there's something there?" Caleb stared across the fading fields. "I don't know. It was the honest answer. She sat beside him. Mom used to say you only got quiet when you were close to solving something. The words landed harder than she intended. For a moment, neither moved. Emma had been gone for 2 years, yet certain comments could still make the loss feel immediate. Close. Alive. Caleb swallowed, then smiled faintly. Your mother always thought she knew everything. Lily smiled back. Usually did. They watched the last sunlight disappear. Neither mentioned the tears gathering in the corners of their eyes. Some grief never fully leaves. It simply changes shape. The breakthrough came 4 nights later. Not through engineering, through paperwork. Caleb had been digging through county agricultural archives searching for equipment records. Most of the files were useless. Old registrations, ownership transfers, maintenance reports. Then he found a name. Harold Voss. A mechanic, independent fabricator, almost forgotten. The tractors had all passed through his workshop over a 20-year period. Caleb spent hours tracking fragments of information. Former customers, old articles, agricultural newsletters. A picture slowly emerged. Harold Voss had been considered eccentric, brilliant by some, difficult by others, obsessed with soil preservation, obsessed enough to spend decades modifying equipment, yet somehow his work had vanished from public attention. No patents, no major contracts, no recognition, just scattered references buried in archives. The deeper Caleb looked, the stranger the story became. Because Harold hadn't failed, he had simply disappeared, and nobody seemed to know why. Near midnight, Caleb returned to the workshop carrying another box of documents. The tractors sat beneath the lights, silent as ever. But they no longer looked like scrap metal. They looked like unfinished conversations, questions waiting decades for answers. He climbed into the cab of one machine and opened another hidden panel. More notes, more markings, more clues. Then he saw something scratched into the metal frame, a set of coordinates, followed by a date. Nothing else. No explanation, no instructions. Just coordinates. Caleb stared at them. A strange feeling settled over him. The same feeling he'd experienced at the auction. The sensation that he was standing near something important. Not valuable, important. He copied the numbers into his notebook, then leaned back in the driver's seat. Outside, distant thunder rolled across the countryside. A summer storm was building somewhere beyond the horizon, and for the first time since discovering the tractors, Caleb realized the mystery might be much larger than a forgotten farming experiment. Because someone had left a trail, and somehow, decades later, it had led directly to him. Chapter 3. The Trail Beyond the Fields. The coordinates pointed nowhere special. At least that's what Caleb thought when he entered them into an old mapping program the next morning. The location appeared as an empty patch of land, nearly 70 miles away. No business, no workshop, no registered property, just a forgotten section of countryside near the edge of a river valley. He stared at the screen while sunlight spilled across the kitchen table. Lily looked over his shoulder. So either Harold Voss wanted people to visit a random field, or we're missing something. She grinned. I vote for the second one. The problem was time. Planting season wasn't waiting. Bills weren't waiting. The bank certainly wasn't waiting. Whatever mystery Harold Voss had left behind, Caleb couldn't simply abandon the farm to chase it. Yet the coordinates lingered in his thoughts throughout the week, while repairing irrigation lines, while ordering seed, while checking soil moisture levels. The numbers kept resurfacing, like an unfinished sentence. Eventually, curiosity won. Early Saturday morning, before sunrise, Caleb loaded coffee into a thermos and climbed into his pickup truck. Lily joined him before he could leave. A backpack hung from one shoulder. You didn't think I was staying behind, did you? You're supposed to be sleeping. It's 5:30. Exactly. She slid into the passenger seat. The discussion ended there. 3 hours later they arrived. The location wasn't entirely empty. A weather-beaten barn stood near the edge of the property. Its roof sagged slightly, grass pushed through cracked concrete. Trees surrounded the structure on 3 sides. The place felt forgotten. Not abandoned, forgotten. Like something history had simply stepped around. Caleb parked and stepped out. Morning air carried the scent of river water and wild grass. For several moments neither spoke. Then Lily pointed. Look! A faded sign hung beside the barn entrance. Most of the paint had disappeared. Only a few words remained visible. Voss Agricultural Research. Caleb felt a pulse of excitement. For the first time, Harold Voss stopped feeling like a rumor. He had been here. Inside the barn, they found rows of workbenches, dust-covered tools, storage cabinets, machinery components, the remains of decades-old experiments. Sunlight filtered through cracks in the walls, creating narrow beams across floating dust particles. The building felt frozen in time. Lily moved slowly through the workshop. This guy built all of this himself? Looks like it. The deeper they explored, the more impressive it became. Blueprints covered entire walls. Engineering sketches filled filing cabinets. Soil studies, crop trials, equipment designs. Years of work, thousands of hours, all hidden from the world. Then they found the journals. 27 notebooks, stacked neatly inside a metal cabinet. Caleb opened the first one carefully. Harold's handwriting filled every page. Observations, calculations, failures, breakthroughs. The journals told the story of a man obsessed with helping small farmers survive. Not by increasing production endlessly, but by reducing waste, reducing costs, preserving soil, building resilience. Harold believed most farms weren't failing because farmers lacked skill. They were failing because the economics had become impossible. His modifications were designed to change that. The realization hit Caleb harder than expected, because Harold's struggle sounded familiar. Too familiar. Page after page described frustration, banks demanding numbers, manufacturers chasing larger equipment, experts dismissing alternative ideas, a lifetime spent being ignored. Caleb sat quietly at one of the workbenches, reading, listening to the silence. In some strange way, he felt like he knew the man. Not personally, but emotionally. Both had spent years trying to hold together things that seemed determined to fall apart. Lily opened another journal, then another. Suddenly she stopped. "Dad," her voice carried a different tone. "What?" "Read this." She handed him a notebook. The entry was dated 12 years before Harold's death. Caleb scanned the page, then read it again and again. Harold had completed a full-scale field test. The results were extraordinary. Lower fuel usage, improved soil health, reduced maintenance costs, higher long-term yields, exactly what Caleb suspected. But the next paragraph changed everything. The project had been rejected, repeatedly. Not because it failed, because nobody wanted to fund further development. The solution wasn't profitable enough for major manufacturers. It extended equipment life instead of encouraging replacement. It reduced dependency instead of increasing it. Harold's work simply didn't fit the industry's priorities. Caleb closed the journal slowly. A deep sadness settled over him. Not anger, sadness. A brilliant idea had spent decades gathering dust because it arrived at the wrong time. Outside, wind rattled the barn walls. The sound echoed softly through the building. For several minutes, neither spoke. Finally, Lily broke the silence. "What are you thinking?" Caleb looked around the workshop. The journals, the forgotten experiments, the years of effort. Then he answered honestly. "I'm thinking he never quit." "What do you mean?" "He kept working, even when nobody listened." The words stayed with him during the drive home, and during the weeks that followed. Because now he wasn't just rebuilding tractors, he was continuing someone else's unfinished work. The challenge became larger and riskier. Using Harold's journals as a guide, Caleb began adapting the system for his own farm. The process wasn't smooth. Some designs failed immediately. Others created unexpected problems. Several late-night experiments ended with broken components and expensive repairs. More than once he considered stopping. The pressure kept increasing. Loan deadlines approached. Weather forecasts looked uncertain. Seed costs climbed again. Every practical voice told him to focus on surviving the season, not reinventing farming methods. Yet the results slowly began appearing. Fuel consumption dropped. Field passes decreased. Soil conditions improved. Not dramatically, not overnight, but enough to notice, enough to keep going. One evening, nearly 4 months after discovering the first hidden compartment, Caleb stood at the edge of a newly planted field. The setting sun painted the horizon in shades of gold and orange. Fresh rows stretched into the distance. The tractor moved steadily across the landscape. Not faster, not louder, simply more efficiently. Owen sat beside him on the tailgate of the pickup, watching, thinking. "Dad? Yeah? Do you think it'll work?" Caleb looked toward the machine crossing the field, toward the future he still couldn't fully see. Then he thought about Harold Voss, the barn, the journals, The years spent believing in something nobody else valued. A small smile appeared. I think we're about to find out. Far above them, dark clouds gathered along the western horizon. The first major storm system of the season was forming. And somewhere beyond those clouds, a challenge was approaching that would test every lesson hidden inside 6 rusted tractors. The harvest and Caleb's future were coming faster than he realized. The storm test. By early August, the crops looked different. Not dramatically, not in a way that would catch the attention of someone driving past at 60 miles an hour. But farmers noticed. Farmers always noticed. The corn stood more evenly across sections that usually struggled during dry periods. Water pooled less after heavy rain. The soil beneath the rows felt looser and healthier. Small differences. Yet small differences were often where fortunes began. Caleb tried not to think too far ahead. Experience had taught him that agriculture punished optimism. One bad storm could erase an entire season. One mechanical failure could destroy months of work. One week of bad weather could turn profit into debt. So he focused on routines: morning inspections, equipment maintenance, field measurements, moisture reports, the same habits that had carried him through difficult years. But beneath those routines, anticipation was growing. Not just for him, for everyone around him. Ray Sutton noticed it first. One afternoon, he pulled his pickup beside Caleb's field and climbed out. The 2 men stood silently for a moment, studying the crocks. Wind rolled gently across the landscape. Rows swayed beneath the late summer sun. Finally, Ray spoke. "Those sections shouldn't look that good." Caleb smiled. "I'll take that as a compliment." "I'm serious." Ray kicked at the soil with his boot. "I've farmed beside this field for 15 years. Another pause. Then, what exactly did you do? Caleb considered the question. Months earlier, he would have launched into explanations about hydraulic systems, traction modifications, and soil preservation techniques. Now he wasn't sure any of those things captured the truth. I paid attention. Ray laughed. That's the most frustrating answer you could have given. But he wasn't joking anymore. For the first time, genuine curiosity had replaced skepticism. The change mattered. Because throughout the county, people were starting to ask questions. The man who bought 6 rusted tractors had become difficult to ignore. Not because he was succeeding. Not yet. Because something unusual was happening, and nobody could fully explain it. 3 weeks later, the weather forecasts changed. At first it seemed routine, a storm system developing west of the state. Nothing uncommon. Then the predictions grew more serious. Meteorologists began mentioning record rainfall, flood potential, high winds, agricultural advisories. Each update sounded worse than the last. By the weekend, local farmers were preparing for impact. Caleb stood in his workshop, studying weather maps. Lily entered carrying her phone. The newest update just came out. He looked up. She didn't need to say more. Her expression said enough. The storm was growing. Outside, the sky already looked different. The kind of atmosphere that seemed to press down on everything beneath it. Even the animals felt uneasy. The first rain arrived late Sunday evening, a steady drizzle, nothing alarming. Then the wind began. Through the night it intensified. Branches bent. Loose equipment rattled. Rain hammered rooftops. By dawn, the storm had transformed into something far more dangerous. Water poured across roads. Ditches overflowed. Visibility disappeared behind sheets of rain. Caleb spent most of the morning securing equipment and checking drainage systems. The farm felt like a battlefield. Every hour revealed a new problem: a blocked culvert, a damaged fence, a flooded access road. Yet what worried him most wasn't visible. It was happening beneath the fields. Soil failure, compaction, root damage. Those invisible problems often caused more destruction than the storm itself. For 2 days, the weather refused to relent. Rain, wind, thunder, darkness. The entire county seemed trapped beneath gray skies. Then, almost as suddenly as it arrived, the storm moved east. The silence afterward felt strange, unnatural, as if the landscape itself needed time to recover. The next morning, Caleb drove into the fields, slowly, carefully, expecting the worst. His stomach tightened with every passing acre. Years of experience had conditioned him to anticipate damage. He crossed the first section, then the second, then the third. Something wasn't right. Or rather, something was. Water had drained faster than expected. The soil structure remained surprisingly intact. Crop damage existed, but far less than neighboring properties had suffered. He stopped the truck, stepped out, knelt beside a row, scooped a handful of soil into his palm. The evidence was everywhere. The modifications had worked. Not perfectly. Nothing in farming ever worked perfectly. But they had worked. The healthier soil absorbed water more effectively. Reduced compaction allowed better drainage. Root systems remained stronger. The differences Harold Voss had spent decades pursuing were suddenly visible. Visible enough to measure. Visible enough to prove. Caleb sat back on his heels. For a long moment, he simply stared across the field. The wind carried the scent of wet earth. Clouds drifted slowly overhead. Sunlight broke through for the first time in days. He wished Harold could see this. The thought surprised him, because Harold had become more than a name in old journals, more than a forgotten mechanic. In some strange way, he had become a partner across time, a man who planted ideas decades earlier and never lived to see them grow. That afternoon, visitors began arriving. First Ray, then 2 neighboring farmers, then several more. Word traveled quickly after a storm. Everyone compared damage. Everyone shared observations. Everyone searched for lessons. By evening, nearly a dozen people had walked portions of Caleb's fields. The conversations grew longer, more serious, less skeptical. Questions replaced jokes. Interest replaced laughter. And for the first time, Caleb realized something important. The tractors were never the story. Neither were the modifications. The real story was what happened if struggling farmers could lower costs without sacrificing productivity. What happened if family farms became more resilient? What happened if survival became slightly easier? The implications stretched far beyond his own acreage. Late that night, after everyone had gone home, Caleb sat alone on the porch. The air felt cool after the storm. Crickets had returned. Stars emerged one by one above the fields. The farm seemed peaceful. For once, the screen door opened softly. Lily stepped outside and sat beside him. "You were right." Caleb laughed. "I've been wrong plenty of times. Not about this." He looked toward the horizon. The fields shimmered beneath moonlight. Quiet, alive, still standing. Months earlier, he'd purchased 6 rusted tractors because of a feeling he couldn't explain. Now, that feeling finally had evidence behind it. But deep down, he sensed this wasn't the finish line. It was the beginning. Because earlier that afternoon, while visitors walked the fields, one of them had quietly introduced himself, not as a farmer, not as a neighbor, but as a researcher from a major agricultural university. And before leaving, the man had handed Caleb a business card and asked a question that would change everything. "Have you ever considered letting the rest of the country see what you've built here?"